We're saving the questions to the end. So our final presentation for this morning will be Eurasian Watermilfoil, Smart Prevention, Smart Management. And that's presented by Alison Mikulyuk. Alison works for the Wisconsin DNR as the Lakes Rivers team leader. Go ahead, Alison.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the intro. Okay, just wanted to do a quick check. I think I'm coming across audio and screen, right?
Looks great.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thanks for joining me, everyone. I'm Alison Mikulyuk with the Wisconsin DNR. Thanks for spending Wisconsin Water Week with us. It's been just a great series of talks that I've experienced so far. I hope you're having a good time too. But today, I'd like to cover a few recent papers that explore the effects of Eurasian watermilfoil, lake-wide herbicide treatments, and also introduces a few tools that I think can help us prioritize prevention and management for this aquatic, exotic, invasive species. So my talk has two parts. First, we're going to start with work from a 2020 study that took a landscape scale approach to understanding patterns in plant community composition. And while looking at plant communities, we asked questions relating to the effects or impacts of Eurasian watermilfoil, as well as the effects or impact of lake-wide herbicide management. After I cover that paper, I'll transition to a second paper published this year that uses a modeling approach to predict lakes that are likely to experience future EWM introductions and exhibit high abundance. So those are the most vulnerable potential EWM lakes in our landscape. So that's what we're going to cover today. So I'll get started right into part one of the talk, understanding invader impacts and the impacts of control. So first of all, we know that non-native invasive species are one of the leading causes of biodiversity decline globally. Their effects are measurable, their modes of impact are incredibly diverse, and they can be absolutely devastating. They have led to massive efforts to educate the public on the value of prevention, which has been just a very, very good a good thing. So here are some examples of some well-known, impactful, sort of anti-charismatic invaders, I guess. But with that, understanding that invasive species are impactful, it's also important to understand that control can have some pretty big impacts too. The upper left video that I hope is playing for you is one of the Laterno tree crusher, which is a very intimidating name. But it was employed to control tamarix populations in the southwestern United States. And those populations of invasive tamarix were actually also providing important functions for migratory stopovers. So that's just kind of to talk about how control is an important tool in our toolbox for preventing the spread of AIS. But that's always good to think about where and how to employ control methods and their potential for non-target impacts. We know that prevention is important. Control can be too, but it starts to get a little complicated. Treatments have a cost too. I think sort of fundamentally what we're trying to do here is figure out how to approach these species in a way that lets us do the least harm and the most good. So one kind of important background piece is that we need to understand that invaders are not all created equal. Some are more harmful than others. One study here suggests that, and for some reason, I can't see the citation on the slide. I'm sorry. If anybody wants that, I'm happy to provide it. One study suggests that between 20 and 30% of non-native aquatic plants have ecological and economic impacts. So that's not all species. If they're not all equally damaging, then the way that we manage them across species might change accordingly. So we understand, generally speaking, how common or rare invasive species are, but what's often missing is an underlying understanding of how impactful they are and how abundant they are where they do exist. So, EWM is present in a lot of lakes. It's frequently a priority of management. But instead of just concentrating on where it is and assuming negative impacts, we set out to determine how much of it was where and whether or not, it was equally damaging in all systems. So we know from what's called a species abundance distribution that, given a sample of around 1,000 lakes, Eurasian water milfoil is actually usually rare. So it's commonly rare and rarely common. So a lot of lakes have very little Eurasian water milfoil, whereas a few lakes have a lot of it. So this tells us a little bit about abundance of populations where they exist on the landscape, but we still don't really know what impact looks like. Does impact reflect abundance, like in a linear fashion? Will the impact curve look exactly like this abundance curve? Are there also only a few lakes with super high impacts and very many lakes with very low impacts? Or does the impact relationship look a little bit differently? So that's one of the questions we set out to answer with a pretty large data set in Wisconsin. So if we kind of look back to what has led up to this study, our understanding of this system, folks have actually answered this question, using a number of different approaches. And kind of depending on how you turn your focus, you might get a different answer to the question of whether or not in most systems Eurasian water milfoil has a negative, neutral, or positive effect. So when you look at the literature, you can kind of see that there might be some contradictions. We've got a lot of information out there, showing native species declines and, large ecological effects of this species. But then we've got other studies that are reporting more sort of neutral or even sometimes apparently positive effects. So it turns out that the studies that focus on one or a handful of systems, they kind of focus on the sort of more notorious, like upper end of that abundance distribution. Those studies tend to reveal very real negative effects of Eurasian water milfoil. But when you look at a landscape scale across multiple lakes, it's a little bit more complicated. There's either a neutral effect or actually, plants are kind of responding positively and increasing in abundance together. So there's no evidence of a negative EWM effect. So, both are actually true. And it just basically kind of depends on your focal frame. So kind of adding on to that literature, it was, it was a bit dated at this time. And, given that we have a huge database of really robustly collected, comparable plant data in the state of Wisconsin, we took the opportunity to kind of leverage that giant data set to ask some of these important questions. So we started, with the large database, and we focused in on 150 lakes with very similar plant communities. So we kind of matched them on species, identity, and abundance. From those 150 similar plant communities, we noticed 47 of them did not have Eurasian water milfoil, 103 of them did. And we took those lakes, compared for some natural variation, like water chemistry, treatment status, and other effects that we think would affect our findings. And then we were able to quantify overall and species-specific effects associated with having and increasing Eurasian water milfoil density. So it turns out that for the most part, again, remember, large sample of lakes, this is a landscape scale study, we found that when Eurasian water milfoil abundance increases, species responses were pretty variable, but they actually were more often positive. On the graph that I'm showing here on the right, the bars represent the number of individual species. So the higher the bar, the more species are kind of crammed into that bar. And then the horizontal axis represents the species response. So positive values on that horizontal axis are species that are responding positively when Eurasian water milfoil increases. And on the other hand, the negative are species that respond negatively. So we can see from the graph there that some tend to increase in response to Eurasian watermilfoil, some tend to decrease, but a lot of them are kind of in the middle. Some might find this result kind of surprising. If overwhelmingly EWM effects across systems were negative, we would not see this kind of relationship. We would probably see a lot more negative responses if competitive displacement was happening all over the place. But kind of remember back to that abundance distribution graph, we're seeing a lot of these systems with, not a lot of Eurasian watermilfoil. So and the other thing this kind of talks about is not really causality. So it's hard to say that, the species is causing a response in the community. In this case, really all we're able to say is that these responses are tracking together. So I think what it suggests to me, these positive responses, really speak to kind of an underlying set of variables that make lakes planty or good for plants in general, regardless of whether or not the plant is invasive or native. In fact, we compared the shape of this graph, which is kind of Eurasian watermilfoil in the role of driver, even though I want to get away from that causal link. We compared that to other native species, and we found a lot of similar relationships. In fact, there were a lot of native species, like Cara is one that comes to mind, the genus, that had more negative effects on other species. So there were other native species that are kind of acting like ecosystem engineers in a way that we didn't necessarily see for Eurasian watermilfoil. So let's talk a little bit now about layering on top of control. And what I'm going to do is move kind of quickly through the background information. We've started with a single system, working up to a set of case studies, and now we have this landscape scale study that looks kind of big picture at herbicide treatments in lakes. So first, we took a course approach. We looked at the number of statistically significant changes from pre to post-treatment and compared those to the background of interannual changes observed in the absence of treatment. These box plots show the median number of species that statistically significantly increase or decrease across time in treated on the left and untreated systems. We see that more increases and more decreases occurred across years when a treatment intervened. That's pretty similar to what we observed in the case studies and the experimental prior work, but now it's kind of nice to have this added context of what typically occurs in unmanaged lakes. Next, we used the same approach that we did for the Eurasian watermilfoil question about impacts to talk about the response to lake-wide herbicide treatments. These treatments kind of varied in terms of the concentration of herbicide applied, but all were designed to have large-scale lake-wide effects, and all used some form of 2,4-D. So what we're looking at here is the same graph with the black lines about Eurasian watermilfoil and the species responses. And now we're adding the gray bars that reflect the species response to experiencing a lake-wide chemical treatment, herbicide treatment, sorry. So again, the distribution kind of reflects the direction of change after experiencing the intervention. And when we compare the bars, the gray and the black bars, we see that some species respond positively, some are neutral, and some are negative. Relative to what we know about EWM as a driver, the responses to herbicide treatment tend to be more negative. So lake-wide treatments in this case, and the distribution is really broad as well, are associated with bigger shifts in community composition because species are responding very differently. So, one of the take-homes here is that lake-wide treatments may potentially be favoring some species over others. So when we kind of look at the comparison of Eurasian watermilfoil and herbicide treatment, I think a couple of things kind of pop out. First of all, management solutions are never a one size fits all. So the findings here, I think, are interesting, but these do not tell us what to do in all situations. For example, does this mean that lake-wide herbicide treatments, since we've seen that they're impactful and on a landscape scale seem to be kind of a bigger effect than Eurasian watermilfoil itself, does that mean that that's never a good idea? Absolutely not. It just reveals that lake-wide herbicide treatments are a particularly sharp tool in our toolbox. We know they have very large effects, but we know the effects of Eurasian watermilfoil can be kind of heterogeneous. So it's really important that we use these very sharp control tools where the adverse effects of Eurasian water milfoil are clear. So instead of kind of the proactive, sort of prevention-oriented, impactful control, we really want to make sure that we're using these control strategies where we already know the ecological effects are present, if ecological effects are in fact our motivating reason for doing the treatment, if that makes sense. So, we know that they're really effective for EWM control, but they can have negative effects too, like almost any management strategy, to be quite honest, any management strategy. It was interesting to learn a little bit about Eurasian water milfoil and impacts. We know where it is. We know kind of approximately how much of it is where in a subset of lakes. And now we can kind of see that, we can't assume ubiquitous negative impacts. It really might depend on kind of that underlying abundance distribution. This paper is available online at Facets. It's open source and free. You can read it if you want. It's kind of a lot of modeling detail, but I think it's a good paper. And that brings us to the second part of the talk. This kind of, all right, so what now? Question. We know about Eurasian water milfoil impacts. We understand some of the options that are available to us for control, including lake-wide herbicide treatments. But what do we do now, right? So being conservative with control decisions and not making decisions based on fear is like a super good principle, but avoiding risk is a really powerful coping strategy. We know that most lakes with Eurasian water milfoil don't have that much of it, but what if your lake is one of the ones that goes high, right? So after a new introduction, it's appropriate to act early to prevention and monitoring. But in terms of control, it's really important to act appropriately. But that almost requires you to see the future for your lake. So that's why I'd like to transition into this idea of predicting where and how to act. And in the whole statewide portfolio of lakes, rivers, and wetlands, where and how should we prevent and control Eurasian water milfoil? And one idea to answering that question is asking us to maybe focus on the most vulnerable lakes first. So what does that mean, vulnerable lake? I am going to define a lake that is vulnerable to Eurasian water milfoil as one where Eurasian water milfoil is likely to arrive, survive, and thrive. Those are 3 invasion filters to consider when you think about where species are likely to be across a landscape. So we've got 3 parts there. The first set of filters, arrival and survival, have to do with where the species is going to occur. So that considers movement across the landscape and lake characteristics, a lake that is survivable for a species. So where will it occur, or abundance, or the presence absence, or locational information for the species covers those first 2 filters, arrival and survival. But when we ask about thriving, we're starting to talk about abundance and how suitable a lake is for a particular species. So in thinking about how abundant Eurasian water milfoil might be across the landscape, we're thinking about lake characteristics that make it particularly nice for the species to exist. So, that's that thrive filter. We can take variables that we have on lakes across the state that reflect those kinds of characteristics that are important for all 3 of those invasion filters, transport, habitat preference, and we can use that to predict which lakes are likely to be invaded, where the species is likely to survive, and where it's likely to be abundant or thrive. So this is a diagram that's basically just a big math funnel. So we take the known variables that are associated with all the lakes in our portfolio, and we put them in a predictive model. We relate what we know about those patterns and what they mean for Eurasian water milfoil, and we can get out the bottom of that math funnel a map that can tell us how likely it is for a lake to have Eurasian water milfoil introduced, and how likely the lake is to support a high abundance. So this is just kind of jumping straight to the model output here. Predicted occurrence on the left, predicted abundance on the right. You can see that the kind of higher risk for occurrence and abundance is kind of concentrated in the south eastern part of the state. These maps reflect areas where we haven't surveyed Eurasian watermilfoil before in addition. So the other thing that we get from this is an understanding that there are still a lot of vulnerable systems out there. And I think this really speaks to the power, the continued power of prevention for this species that is already in probably over 1,000 water bodies, at least in the state of Wisconsin. Still a lot more places it could go and introduce and become abundant. So again, great plug for prevention. But now that we understand like the occurrence, so the arrival, survival, and the abundance, the thriving, we can combine those two very important pieces of understanding a population's distribution into what I call kind of a management priority map. So if we want to focus on highly vulnerable lakes, then we are going to want to look for lakes where it's likely to arrive, is likely to thrive, and likely to survive. Wrong order, but you get what I'm saying. The management priority tier number 1, those purple lakes down in the southeast, are lakes where those filters are all at kind of high risk. So likely to get there, likely to survive, and likely to grow to high abundance. That to me is a big control priority. So hopefully, kind of like processing the model that way and producing those predictions for both abundance and occurrence can help us focus our attention in ways that can make our prevention and control efforts more effective. So I think I went through most of my take homes. Most lakes are not likely to support high abundance, but it's nice to know where they might be. And using this information to better plan and prioritize our efforts, I think can only help in the long run. So if folks are interested in getting those predictions or looking at the maps in more detail, the paper's on the left. Again, you can get it open source online. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Allison, and to all of our speakers. We've got just a couple minutes for questions. So Allison, I'm going to jump to one for you first. Did you standardize your data for lakes that have a history of management when determining which lakes have, quote, a lot or a little EWM?
Yeah, I guess I wish I could. Let me pull up this thing. Standardize the data for lakes that have a history of management. Does that, I wonder if they're talking about data transformation and putting everything on the same scale so that the different maxima and minima don't affect the model. If that's the question, then yes.
I think it looks, a keyword there might be the history of management and how that influenced how you classified those lakes.
A lot or a little. I'm having trouble fielding that. I'm sorry. I'm happy to follow up with folks afterwards.
Right. And that's good because there's a number of questions in here we're not going to have time to get to. So I encourage folks to reach out to the speakers through EventMobi or direct email if we don't get to you. Laura, a question for you. It looks like you have mostly Labradors. Is that by design? Any comment on how different dog breeds perform in this type of work?
Yeah, great question. My 2 dogs, which are Ernie and Betty White, those are definitely by design. I selected both of them from breeders that bred for detection. Our other dogs, we do have some other breeds. So I encourage you guys to check those doggos out on our website, midwestconservationdogs.com. Generally speaking, we look for a dog that has a bunch of different variables, but one that's motivated to work under some pretty demanding conditions. And also a dog that's of kind of medium-ish size. So like between 40 and 70 pounds or so. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. So if you guys have additional desire to learn more, just reach out to me via email, or I'll be in the River Alliance virtual booth tonight or not tonight, but this afternoon from 3 to 3:30. So can continue that conversation.
Thanks, Laura. Well, we're at noon, so I know we have a plenary coming up next, so I'm going to stop the Q&A for now. Again, I think there's been a few answers posted in the Q&A box too, so you might look at there if you posted a question and haven't got the answer yet. That wraps up this morning's session on aquatic invasive species. We encourage you to head over to the plenary on the virtual main stage that's starting now. Thank you for joining us this morning, and please enjoy the rest of Wisconsin Water Week.